Water crashed over the white mare's trembling body as she fought to keep her head above the surging flood, her once pristine coat now plastered against her heaving sides. The ancient oaks behind her bent and groaned under the storm's fury, their massive trunks partially submerged in the rising deluge that had already claimed everything else in sight. This wasn't just another coastal tempest. This was nature's wrath unleashed with terrifying precision, and Serenity stood at its mercy, a solitary beacon of life in a landscape transformed into a roiling, merciless sea. Just hours earlier, the sky above Preston Walker's modest farm had shown only the faintest hints of the coming apocalypse. The 72-year-old farmer had watched the horizon with growing unease as clouds gathered with unnatural speed, stacking themselves into towers of slate and charcoal. The radio beside him had crackled with increasingly urgent warnings, but Preston's eyes remained fixed on Serenity, her white coat gleaming against the darkening landscape before the rain began. The mare had sensed it first, her head lifting suddenly, nostrils flaring as she detected the shift in pressure that preceded catastrophe. Animals always knew before humans when disaster approached. That primal awareness remained untamed, even in creatures that had lived alongside mankind for centuries. Preston's weathered hands had trembled as he reached for his jacket, 5 decades of coastal farming etched into his leathery skin. There was no time for careful planning. The wind already bent the tall grasses of the lower pasture into violent waves that mirrored the increasingly hostile ocean beyond. The storm had accelerated beyond all forecasts, beyond all preparation. Serenity wasn't just livestock. She was the living embodiment of his last promise to Eleanor. His wife had bred the mare from her favorite bloodline. The foal, born the same month cancer finally claimed her. "Keep her safe," Eleanor had whispered during those final days. For 8 years, he had honored that promise through bitter winters and scorching summers. But nature recognized no such promises. The first surge had come without warning. A wall of water that separated man from mare in an instant. Preston had watched in horror from higher ground as the flood swept through his property with impossible speed, leaving Serenity stranded on a rapidly shrinking island of soil where the barn once stood. Now, as lightning split the unnaturally dark sky, the white mare fought with fading strength against the current swirling around her legs. Her eyes, wide with terror, reflected each electric flash. What neither Preston nor Serenity could possibly know, as water continued to rise inch by merciless inch, was that their story, a tale of loss, desperate hope, and unexpected salvation, was only beginning. The heavens exploded with a deafening crack as lightning struck the ancient oak beside Preston's weathered barn, sending splinters of wood raining down like deadly arrows. Nature had abandoned all restraint, unleashing fury beyond anything the coastal forecasters had predicted or the old farmer had witnessed in his 7 decades of life. The rain didn't fall. It attacked, sheets of water driven horizontally by winds that screamed with almost human voices across the suddenly unfamiliar landscape of Preston's generational farm. Inside the barn, Serenity's eyes rolled white with terror as the structure around her began to surrender to the storm's assault. Wooden beams that had stood strong for 60 years groaned under the strain, the sound of cracking timber rising above even the howling gale outside. Preston fought against the barn door, his aged muscles straining against the wind that seemed determined to keep him from reaching his precious mare. His rain-soaked clothes clung to his thin frame as water already pooled around his ankles. The ancient structure shuddered with each new gust, the roof beginning to peel away in sections, exposing the interior to the storm's merciless bombardment. Preston finally forced his way inside, water cascading from his drenched form. As he reached Serenity's stall, the white mare trembled, her coat already slick with water pouring through the compromised ceiling. Her ears flattened against her head as another thunderous boom shook the very foundation beneath them. Preston's gnarled fingers worked frantically at the stall latch, his movements slowed by the cold and fear. The rising water had already reached his shins, swirling with debris torn from the collapsing structure. With each passing second, the barn surrendered another piece of itself to the tempest's rage. Serenity sensed the urgency, her powerful body tensed and ready to bolt toward higher ground once freed. The stall door finally swung open, and Preston grasped the mare's halter, his weathered hand steadying her as they turned toward the barn entrance. What happened next would haunt his dreams for whatever remained of his life. A sound like the world splitting apart as the creek behind the property burst its banks. The wall of water hit the barn with unstoppable force, tearing through the wooden walls as if they were paper. The floodwater struck Preston with brutal force, ripping his grip from Serenity's halter and sending him tumbling into the churning darkness. His last glimpse was of white disappearing in the opposite direction. Serenity swept away by a different current as the barn disintegrated around them. The roaring water carried him mercilessly across what had once been his lower pasture, his lungs burning as he fought to keep his head above the debris-filled torrent. When he finally caught hold of a partially submerged fence post, pulling himself into a desperate embrace with the splintered wood, Preston could see nothing of his mare, his barn, or the life he had built, only water stretching in every direction, punctuated by the tops of trees that still stood defiant against nature's rampage. Survival became a war between instinct and exhaustion. As Serenity's powerful legs churned through the swirling floodwaters that had swallowed Preston's farm, without mercy or hesitation, the white mare's nostrils flared desperately above the churning surface, each breath a victory against the storm that seemed determined to claim her. Nature in its blind fury had transformed peaceful pastures into a roaring inland sea, with only the occasional treetop breaking the endless expanse of angry water that stretched to every horizon. The current pulled at Serenity's body with greedy hands, threatening to drag her under with each faltering step. Her muscles, bred for grace and speed across solid ground, now fought against an enemy they were never designed to defeat. Yet something deep within her refused surrender, perhaps the same stubborn spirit that had drawn Eleanor to her bloodline all those years ago. The mare's eyes, wide with primal fear, searched the transformed landscape for any refuge from the merciless flood. As if answering an unspoken prayer, the current suddenly pushed Serenity toward what remained of the farm's highest pasture, a small island of mud and tangled grass, barely rising above the floodwaters. Her hooves scraped against solid ground, finding desperate purchase as she dragged herself from the water's clutches. Behind her, a stand of ancient oaks, trees that had witnessed generations of the Walker family work this land, bent against the howling wind, their massive trunks partially submerged, but still defiant. Serenity stood trembling in the center of her shrinking sanctuary, her once brilliant white coat now plastered against her heaving ribcage, stained with mud and debris. The elegant creature that had once pranced across sun-dappled fields now stood hunched against the driving rain, head lowered, each exhausted breath visible in the unnaturally cold air. Water continued its relentless advance, creeping inch by merciless inch around her hooves, consuming her refuge with methodical patience. Lightning split the blackened sky, illuminating Serenity's solitary figure for a breathtaking instant, a statue of pure white against the dark chaos, a single point of life amidst devastation. The ancient trees behind her cast twisted shadows across the water with each electric flash, their silhouettes like gnarled guardians watching over the mare. Had Preston been able to see her in that moment, he might have found both heartbreak and hope in the image. His precious Serenity still standing despite impossible odds. But the water showed no compassion for her exhaustion, continuing its silent rise against her trembling legs. Each passing minute shrank her island further, the boundary between sanctuary and peril dissolving with terrifying certainty. Serenity shifted nervously, instinct warning her of the diminishing refuge, even as fatigue urged her to remain still. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to escape the hunger of the flood. All she could do was stand, wait, and endure as the storm continued its assault, and the waters rose ever higher around her shivering form. Dawn revealed a world unrecognizable. The once familiar landscape transformed into a vast, muddy lake, where the remnants of lives floated like abandoned dreams. Preston Walker stood on the makeshift relief platform that had been a gas station roof just yesterday, his bloodshot eyes scanning the water's surface for any flash of white amid the debris. His clothes, still damp from the night before, hung on his thin frame like memories too heavy to discard. A crude bandage wrapped his left forearm where a piece of his own barn had sliced through flesh during his desperate swim to safety. The search teams had already told him what logic demanded he accept. No horse could have survived the wall of water that had devoured his farm. Their words, though spoken with kindness, landed like blows against his already battered heart. They had real victims to find, human lives hanging in the balance. A man Preston had known for 30 years, the local veterinarian, had placed a firm hand on his shoulder and spoken the words that reality required. But Preston's heart refused. The odds were impossible. Let her go. But letting go of Serenity meant letting go of Eleanor too. That white mare carried more than just herself. She bore the weight of promises made to a dying woman, the last living thread connecting Preston to the love that had defined his existence. The gold wedding band still circling his finger caught the morning light as he raised a pair of borrowed binoculars to his eyes once more, ignoring the pain that shot through his injured arm. Other survivors moved around him, their voices a distant hum against the ringing in his ears. They saw an old man obsessed with livestock, while homes and livelihoods lay in ruins. What they couldn't see was that Serenity wasn't just an animal, she was the vessel into which he had poured all his remaining love after Eleanor's passing. Each morning spent brushing her coat, each apple sliced into perfect quarters, each whispered conversation at dusk. These moments had kept him anchored to purpose after grief had threatened to untether him completely. The floodwaters had claimed everything else. The farmhouse built by his grandfather, the fields where he had spent 7 decades of seasons, the photographs and letters that chronicled a life shared. All gone, carried away by currents that cared nothing for the value of what they destroyed. If Serenity was gone too, what remained? An old man with nothing but memories and no place to house them. A rescue boat approached the platform, volunteers offering to take survivors to higher ground, where buses waited. Preston shook his head, his weathered face set with stubborn resolve. The young coordinator tried again, explaining that another storm system was approaching. Preston simply turned away, raising the binoculars once more to scan the distance where his farm had once stood. He would not leave, not while there remained even the slightest chance that somewhere against all odds, a white mare still fought to survive the rising waters. Hope flickered like a fragile flame as the volunteer drone operator leaned forward, squinting at the small screen, displaying live footage from above the flooded countryside. Something white caught among the debris had triggered his attention, something that didn't match the browns and grays of devastation. The young man adjusted the drone's position, heart racing as the camera zoomed in on what logic insisted couldn't possibly exist. A living, breathing horse, standing on a shrinking island of mud, surrounded by the merciless flood. The rescue coordinator's eyes widened as she called others to witness the impossible. There, amid a landscape transformed by catastrophe, stood Serenity, her once gleaming coat now mud-stained but unmistakable against the murky waters. The mare's head hung low, exhaustion evident in every line of her body, yet she remained upright, a solitary monument to survival against impossible odds. Behind her, massive fallen oaks created a tangled barrier, their ancient trunks and branches forming a prison that had both protected her from being swept away and now prevented her escape. Word spread through the makeshift command center with electric speed, reaching Preston within minutes. The elderly farmer pushed past volunteers to see the drone footage, his weathered face transforming as disbelief gave way to desperate hope. His mare had survived the night. His promise to Eleanor remained unbroken. For now, but the small island where Serenity stood was shrinking with each passing hour, the water creeping higher as tides changed and upstream dams threatened to overflow. The rescue coordinator pointed to radar images showing another weather system approaching. They had hours, not days, before the waters would rise again, this time potentially high enough to submerge Serenity's sanctuary completely. Teams quickly assembled, calculating distances, assessing risks, weighing options that all seemed impossible. The location was unreachable by standard boats due to submerged hazards, too dangerous for helicopter approach with the tangle of trees, too far for a swimmer to safely reach against the current. Preston watched the frantic planning with a stone-faced calm that belied the storm raging within him. On the small screen, Serenity shifted nervously as water lapped against her fetlocks, her once proud stance now a trembling testament to endurance. The mayor, who had carried the weight of his heart for 8 years now, stood at the mercy of strangers who saw not just livestock, but a life worth saving. The rescue team leader approached Preston with a plan that balanced on the knife edge between possible and suicidal. It would require specialized equipment being airlifted from 3 counties away, volunteers willing to risk their own safety, and the cooperation of a terrified, exhausted horse with strangers. The odds were vanishingly small, but as Preston looked at the screen once more, at the white mare standing alone against the rising waters, he saw not just Serenity but Eleanor's spirit, both refusing to surrender until the very end. The race against time had begun. Darkness transformed the rescue operation into something primeval, the floodwaters reflecting beams of emergency lights like a nightmare playground of twisted shadows and uncertain depths. The specialized water rescue team stood silently assessing the situation, their expressions grim beneath rain-slicked hoods. These men and women had pulled people from raging rivers, extracted survivors from submerged vehicles, but never attempted to save a 1,200-pound horse stranded on a rapidly vanishing island nearly half a mile from stable ground. The wind howled a warning of more storms to come as they unloaded equipment designed for human rescue that now seemed woefully inadequate for the task before them. 2 previous attempts had already failed spectacularly. The airboat had been unable to navigate the labyrinth of submerged obstacles, its propeller fouling on hidden debris. A helicopter approach had spooked Serenity into panicked movement that nearly sent her slipping into the deeper waters beyond her tiny sanctuary. Each failure had carved deeper lines into Preston's weathered face as he watched from the command post, his weathered hands gripping the metal railing until his knuckles matched the white of his mare's coat. The rescue team leader, a former Navy diver with eyes that had witnessed both miracles and tragedies, unrolled waterproof maps across the hood of a mud-splattered truck. His fingers traced possible approaches through the flooded terrain, each route presenting its own deadly challenges. Their plan crystallized into something that blended calculation with desperation. A modified Zodiac craft would carry 2 handlers skilled with large animals, guided by ropes anchored to the sturdiest remaining trees. If they could reach Serenity, specialized flotation devices might support her weight long enough to guide her through a narrow corridor of slightly shallower water. Equipment designed for human rescue was hastily modified. As volunteers worked beneath portable lights, horse handlers consulted with water rescue specialists, worlds colliding in desperate innovation. A veterinarian prepared sedatives, enough to calm but not incapacitate, knowing the delicate balance between a horse too panicked to save and one too drugged to swim. Every calculation balanced on the knife edge between Serenity's survival and the rescuer's safety. Preston insisted on joining the operation despite protests about his age and injury. His knowledge of the terrain beneath the waters could prove crucial, but more importantly, Serenity knew him, might trust him when fear would make her resist strangers. The team leader recognized the resolution in the old farmer's eyes and finally nodded consent, helping him into a specialized dry suit that hung loose on his thin frame. As the modified Zodiac was prepared for launch, Preston approached the water's edge, his eyes fixed on the distant white shape barely visible in the spotlight beams. Around him, the rescue team secured lines, checked equipment, and exchanged quiet words that acknowledged the danger without surrendering to it. The mission balanced on an impossible equation: the physics of floodwater against the weight of a horse, the psychology of a terrified animal against human determination, the promise made to a dying woman against the laws of nature itself. The boat slipped into the dark water, carrying with it more than equipment and rescuers. It carried the stubborn flame of hope against all rational expectation. Life's fragility revealed itself in terrifying clarity as Serenity's trembling legs finally betrayed her, the mare's exhausted body sliding into deeper water with a heart-stopping splash that echoed across the flooded landscape. Hours of standing in rising water had drained her powerful muscles of their strength, leaving her vulnerable to the hungry current that had waited patiently for this moment. The white mare's eyes rolled with primal terror, her head barely above the surface as she struggled to find purchase against the slick mud beneath churning waters. Every instinct that had kept her alive through the long night now fought against the cold embrace of flood waters, eager to claim their final prize. From the shore, Preston's weathered face contorted in silent anguish, the deep lines around his eyes carving deeper as he watched his last connection to Eleanor disappearing beneath the murky surface. The rescue team's boat was still 20 yards away, fighting against the treacherous current and submerged obstacles. Time, that precious currency they had been spending in increasingly desperate amounts, had finally run out. The elderly farmer lunged forward, only to be restrained by rescue workers who knew he would become another victim if allowed to enter the deadly waters. Serenity's white head emerged once more, nostrils flaring desperately above the water's surface, eyes wild with a fear beyond comprehension. Her front hooves thrashed frantically, finding nothing but water where solid ground had been moments before. The mare who had survived the initial flood, who had somehow found refuge against impossible odds, now surrendering inch by inch to exhaustion and the merciless physics of water against flesh. The rescue boat's engine roared with sudden urgency, the team abandoning their carefully plotted course for a direct approach despite the dangers. The veterinarian readied long-range sedative darts, a last resort they had hoped to avoid. Using them now risked Serenity drowning in a drugged haze, but without intervention, the outcome was grimly certain. Every second stretched into eternity as Preston watched, his calloused hands pressed against his mouth, decades of hardship unable to prepare him for this moment of helpless witness. Serenity's head disappeared again, this time remaining beneath the surface longer. When she re-emerged, her struggles had weakened visibly, the fierce spirit that had kept her fighting now dimming like a candle in hurricane winds. The boat was closer now, but still too far, the rescuers' faces etched with the unique tension of professionals watching a situation deteriorate beyond their control. A rope splashed across the water, falling short of the struggling mare. Another followed, this one landing across her neck, but slipping away before the team could secure it. The third attempt, born of desperation and perfect aim, looped around her head, just as Serenity's strength seemed to abandon her completely. The mare's body began to sink, her eyes rolling back as water lapped at her nostrils. The lead rescuer plunged into the flood without hesitation, safety protocols abandoned in the face of imminent loss. His hands found purchase on Serenity's halter, lifting her nose above water as the boat maneuvered closer, against training, against logic, against every rule of flood rescue. Human determination now battled directly against nature's indifferent power. Preston fell to his knees on the shoreline, his weathered face transformed by the collision of desperate hope and unbearable fear as he watched strangers risk everything to save the last living embodiment of his heart. The final chance to save a life hung suspended between hope and heartbreak, as specialized flotation harnesses arrived at the command post, carried by mud-splattered volunteers who had driven through the night. Dawn painted the flooded landscape in harsh clarity, revealing what the darkness had mercifully concealed. Serenity no longer stood but floated, her exhausted body supported by two rescuers who had remained in the frigid water for hours, taking turns to keep the white mare's head above the surface. Their faces showed the toll of night-long immersion, skin bleached pale, lips blue with cold, Yet their grip remained unwavering, a human bridge between life and the abyss that waited beneath the murky waters. Preston watched with haunted eyes as the specialized team prepared their final attempt. The night had carved decades into his weathered face, transforming him into something ancient and hollowed. The equipment, designed for flood-stranded cattle but never tested on horses, represented their last desperate gambit against a nature that had already claimed so much. Carefully engineered straps and flotation panels were designed to distribute the horse's weight across the water's surface, allowing her to be guided to higher ground without requiring strength she no longer possessed. The rescue boat approached Serenity with careful precision, the team moving with deliberate slowness to avoid triggering what little fight or flight response remained in the mare's depleted system. Through the spotting scope, Preston watched as they carefully positioned the first harness, murmuring constant reassurances that reached the horse, but not the shore. For a moment, terror flashed in Serenity's eyes, a final surge of panic that might doom them all if she thrashed against her rescuers. Then something remarkable happened. The mare's gaze shifted past the rescuers, past the boat, finding Preston on the distant shore with uncanny precision. Despite the chaos of emergency vehicles, volunteers and equipment, horse and master locked eyes across the expanse of churning water. Something passed between them, some silent communication that transcended species. Preston nodded once, a barely perceptible movement, and Serenity's resistance melted away. She surrendered to the hands that worked to save her, allowing the rescuers to secure the complicated harness around her mud-caked body. The radio crackled with the team leader's voice. They were ready. Specialized winches began to take tension, lifting Serenity's body just enough to relieve her exhausted muscles without removing the buoyancy of water. The mare hung suspended between sky and flood, her white coat stained with mud but still visible against the gray morning. Slowly, agonizingly, the rescue boat began to move, guiding Serenity through the channel they had marked during the night. A sudden shift in current, perhaps from a collapsed structure upstream, sent the boat lurching sideways. The carefully maintained tension on the support lines wavered. Serenity's body twisted in the harness, one leg breaking free and plunging into deeper water. The mare's eyes rolled white with renewed panic, her head thrashing against the guide ropes. On shore, Preston's heart seized in his chest as he watched years of patient work with the once spirited mare dissolve into primal terror. For one terrible moment, it seemed that nature would claim its victory. After all, that hope, rescue teams, specialized equipment, and human determination would prove insufficient against the simple physics of flood and fear. Preston found himself moving forward, ignoring the restraining hands of emergency workers, wading into the shallows at the edge of the rescue zone. He raised one weathered hand toward his mare, not in farewell, but in fierce, stubborn promise. The team leader saw the movement and understood. With quick commands, the rescuers repositioned, realigning Serenity toward the distant figure of her master. The mare's struggles calmed as her eyes once again found Preston. Her leg rejoined the harness, her body realigning with the rescue effort. Against all odds, against exhaustion and fear, Serenity chose to fight alongside the humans battling to save her, matching their determination with her own renewed will to survive. The impossible rescue continued its slow, tense journey toward shore. Miracles come in moments when all hope seems lost. As Serenity's hooves finally touched solid ground, after an ordeal that had tested the limits of both human determination and equine will, the white mare stumbled forward, her legs trembling beneath a body pushed far beyond exhaustion, flanks heaving with each precious breath. Preston Walker stood motionless as rescuers guided her the final few steps, his weathered face transformed by emotions too complex for simple names. When Serenity's mud-caked muzzle finally pressed against his outstretched hand, something broke open inside the old farmer, not in fracture but in release, like winter ice giving way to spring's insistent warmth. The weeks that followed wrote a story of dual recovery. Horse and master, both navigating the path from survival to renewal. A neighboring farm offered temporary shelter, while Preston sorted through the wreckage of his life. Serenity's physical wounds: pressure sores from standing in floodwaters, muscle damage from fighting currents, pneumonia from inhaled water, required daily treatment from the same veterinarians who had once advised Preston to abandon hope. Each small improvement in the mare's condition seemed to straighten the old man's spine, bringing color back to his hollowed cheeks as if their recoveries were bound by invisible threads. The community that had gathered to witness the impossible rescue now rallied around its aftermath. Volunteers appeared with lumber and tools to rebuild fences on higher ground. Local farmers donated hay and feed. Children brought carrots and apples, standing in respectful silence as they watched the white mare whose survival had become something of a legend in the storm-ravaged region. A county away, a widow whose husband had been lost in the same flood donated her untouched pasture land to Preston, a gift born from the shared understanding that some connections transcend law. 6 months after the waters receded, Serenity stood at the gate of her new pasture, her coat once again gleaming white in the morning sun. The physical evidence of her ordeal had faded, visible only in a slight hitch to her gait and a new weariness of heavy rain. Preston unlatched the gate, stepping back as the mare hesitated for just a moment before moving forward. Her first steps were cautious, measured, but then something shifted in her bearing. With a sudden toss of her head, Serenity broke into a gallop across the open field, her mane flying like a banner against the blue sky. Preston watched from the fence line, his face creased, not just with age, but with the particular wisdom that comes only through surviving what once seemed unsurvivable. The storm had taken nearly everything: his home, his possessions, his sense of security, yet somehow had given back something more precious, a profound understanding that life's most devastating moments sometimes hide unexpected second chances waiting just beyond the darkness. As Serenity ran with reclaimed joy across her new pasture, the old promise to Eleanor remained unbroken, not despite the storm, but because of how they had weathered it together. If you found this story of survival and hope touching, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Your support helps us continue sharing these stories of resilience and unexpected second chance. Thank you for watching, and I'll hope to see you in the next video.